Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak today and be part of this really exciting conference. My name is Becca Jablonski, and I'm an assistant professor and food systems extension economist in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at Colorado State. So the first part of this presentation is recorded, as you know, but I'm excited to be able to answer questions about anything I talk about a little bit later today. So the first thing I wanted to do is give you an overview of some of the trends in local and regional food systems and some definitions about what we mean when we talk about local and regional food systems. And then I'm going to talk about what we know about the farm and ranch profitability impacts of sales through these local food markets, as well as what we know about the regional economic impacts of local food system programming and investments. And then I'm going to end with talking about some of the things that we are doing at Colorado State University, and particularly things that we're doing to strengthen rural-urban linkages, right? Of course, as we're going to talk about, most local food markets occur in urban places and are a result of largely urban demand for these highly differentiated products, right, around local food attributes. But of course, most farmers and ranchers are still in rural places. So when we talk about local food, really what we're trying to talk about is how we both meet the demands and needs of urban places at the same time that we're also supporting farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. So the USDA National Ag Statistics Service did a local foods survey for the first time in 2015, and they found that there was an estimated almost $9 billion in local food sales, and that almost 100 or over 167,000 farms and ranches were actually participating in these markets. I also just want to briefly apologize in advance that some of the data may seem a little bit dated. The 2015 Local Food Marketing Survey is the only time that survey has been conducted, so that's really the most recent data we have there. And of course, the Ag Census happens every 5 years and happened in 2017, but that data has not yet been released, although should be shortly. And luckily for you all, you have Sarah Lowe, who's really an expert in the census and can answer any additional questions that you have. So though we had an estimated almost $9 billion in local food sales in 2015, there are some industry estimates that the local food sales are projected to increase to about $20 billion by 2020. And when we talk about local food, we tend to talk about two different types of markets. So the first is a direct-to-consumer market. This represents about 35% of sales according to that local food survey. And this includes sales through things like farmers markets, farm stores, roadside stands, CSAs, and something where that end consumer of the product is actually purchasing directly from the farm. And though I think we often think about direct-to-consumer sales as synonymous with local food, really we see that the majority of local food sales occur through these intermediated markets. And intermediated markets include sales to retailers, right? That includes supermarkets, super centers, restaurants, things like that, as well as sales to institutions and intermediary businesses. And so you can see that that's about 2/3 of total local food sales. And I think one of the pieces of evidence that I use when I'm talking to stakeholders in Colorado and throughout the country about sort of how pervasive local food has become, we see that about 42% of school districts are now participating in farm to school. This doesn't mean that they're purchasing 100% of their products locally, but that they're participating to some extent in either local procurement or doing some education around agriculture or food. And according to the Farm to School Census, we've done 2 farm to school censuses across the country, that there was about $790 million of local food purchases in the 2013-2014 school year, right? And that was up pretty significantly from that first farm to school census. We see that local food is actually big business, right? Walmart announced that it was going to increase its purchasing of local food up to 11%, and I believe they were going to do that by about 2015. They actually were able to do it by about 2011, And now the most recent data I could find is that Walmart sells almost $750 million annually in local food. Right, we also see chain stores that are doing this, right? The Shake Shack and Longhorn Steakhouse and many others, right? They recognize that there's a lot of consumer interest in purchasing products that are made from locally grown sources, and therefore they've seen this as a way to attract and retain customers. There have also been substantial federal investments to support local food. So between 2008 and 2014, we saw over $1 billion in investment to support local and regional food systems, and particularly infrastructure to support local and regional food systems. And part of the rationale here is that as we see using national data, that small and mid-scale farms are less likely to have positive operating profit margins, right? They're less likely to be profitable. And one of the purported reasons for this is that because of consolidation that we've had in really every segment of the food system, that it's more difficult for small and mid-scale farms to get access to the infrastructure necessary to be able to market and sell their product. And so some of this infrastructure investment has been around food hubs, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? So trying to recreate aggregation and distribution infrastructure specifically to support small and mid-scale farms, right? Other things have been around the local food promotion program, the farmers market promotion program, research around organic ag. We saw the 2014 Farm Bill actually tripled funding for marketing and promotion of local foods. And then most recently, we just passed the 2018 Farm Bill, and we see new provisions, for example, the LAMP program, the Local Agriculture Marketing Program, and what it's doing is providing $50 million a year in mandatory permanent funds. So it took some of these existing local food programs, for example, the Farmers Market Promotion Program, Local Food Promotion Program, Value Added Producer Grant Program, and actually made it so that the funding is going to be mandatory or permanent. It also adds new functions that allow both programs to provide financial assistance for food safety infrastructure upgrades and certification. And of course, we know that this is important given changes in food safety regulation, especially for fruit and vegetables. It also reauthorizes the FINI program, which is the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, and includes over $250 million over 5 years. So you can see that the FINI program, right, it often ties local food purchasing with these healthy food incentives. It actually pilots a produce prescription program. You see this Harvesting Health Pilots program, which is going to now be required for up to 10% of funds through FINI. So we see that this continued investment is occurring, though maybe we've seen changes under the Trump administration from what we've seen under Obama administration. Perhaps most notably that the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food task force that was created under President Obama doesn't exist in the same capacity under Trump, although that staff person or the person who was a political appointee in facilitating that initiative under Obama, that was actually made a permanent staff person towards the end of that administration, and that person is still there, Tricia Kovacs, who's now a USDA Ag Marketing Service employee. One of the big changes I think we see under the 2018 Farm Bill regarding local foods is support for urban agriculture, right? We see that there's now going to be a competitive grants program with $10 million in mandatory funding to support urban, indoor, and other emerging ag production, research, education, extension, right? This is the first time we've had something like that. And we're actually going to have a new Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Forms of Production, right? And so though that program itself and that new office has no mandatory funding allocation, we do see that this was created and that it's going to have the authority to administer competitive grants, although currently does not have any funding allocated to it. And the final thing I wanted to highlight with the 2018 Farm Bill is that it's also reauthorizing the REAP program, which is the Renewable Energy for America program, which many of the farmers that I work with have taken advantage of to get alternative renewable energy implemented on the farm. The Business and Industry Loan Guarantee Program is also continuing, and it still continues to include that regional food enterprise provision, right? So this helps to create loans, again, to provide some of that infrastructure to support local food. The Healthy Food Financing Initiative has also continued, and it's actually it's expanded in some of its language to include the healthy food enterprises as well as food retailers. And then the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program also received over $20 million a year in mandatory funding. So again, what I'm trying to set the stage for here is that not only do we see growth in interest from these direct-to-consumer and intermediated markets, right? We see that those are growing. We also see that there's continued interest from federal policymakers in supporting local and regional food systems. And part of that funding is really to support both farmers as well as communities. This is something that comes out of the American Farmland Trust, right? It talks about that if you have local food systems, farmers win and communities win. And as I was saying, this is why we have policy not just at the federal level, but state and local levels to support local and regional food systems. Of course, there's other purported benefits of local food around, increases in healthy eating. I'm not going to talk about that today. That's really not the work that I do. But there's really a lot of additional research that's needed to know the extent to which farmers win and your community wins. And so what I'm going to do now is sort of highlight what we know about each of these, because I think it helps us to think through what these kinds of investments can actually do to support meeting the goals that we may have as communities to supporting farmers and ranchers. And along those lines, I just want to highlight that, I think sometimes I work with community groups who talk about their goal being local food. I really don't think that the goal of most communities is actually to have, increased local food production or consumption. I think the goals are really around things like environmental outcomes or healthy eating outcomes or supporting the next generation of farmer and rancher outcomes or supporting opportunities for regional economic development, right? And that local and regional food systems may be a way to achieve those goals. And so that's something I hope that you will discuss or are already discussing within your communities. So farm and ranch viability or profitability. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things we know is that profit margin increases with farm size. So if you look over at the left-hand side of this chart, right, we see the smaller scale operations, and you see that there is much larger percentage of these operations that are in this sort of high risk zone, right? This means that they have much less ability to absorb risks that might happen, right? Changes in commodity market prices, droughts, right? Other natural disasters. And so what we want to do is to help these producers be more profitable so that they can actually absorb risks, which we know are sort of ever present in agriculture. We also have very clear evidence and documented consumer willingness to pay a premium for food that's marketed as local. And Sarah Lowe led up a report that was congressionally mandated by the USDA Economic Research Service several years ago now, and it really compiled different research that had happened in this space. And so here are some of the examples of the studies, right? But we see very clear evidence that consumers are willing to pay a premium for local food. However, that willingness to pay a premium doesn't necessarily fully account for the fact that we know that there are additional costs associated with sales through these local food markets. And so even though revenue, right, might increase based on increased willingness to pay, we see that costs are also likely to increase at the same time. And so this doesn't in and of itself tell us whether or not producers are more likely to be profitable if they're selling through these channels. So one cool thing for those of us who really love data is that there has been a really proliferation of data that is available now that lets us look at farms that are participating through these alternative markets. And until really about 2008, we really had almost no data available. And so even though we've had USDA and Farm Management Associations, Farm Credit, and others that have been tracking profitability and expenditures and sales, it's almost historically all done by commodity and not necessarily done by market channel. And so now that we have this different data, we can analyze profitability impacts in different ways. In addition to the national level data, we also have some data that's become available that's been funded by USDA Ag Marketing Service that's at the state level. or market level that lets us look at some farmers market price reporting. And I've been fortunate in Colorado because my colleague Martha Sullins has been leading this up. And so we can do some interesting things with this data. So for example, she's been collecting data for I think about 7 years now. And we can look at things like 4 commodities and whether or not it differentiates it based on some kind of certification, so USDA organic or another certification or no certification, and by market, if there's actually premiums associated with doing that kind of certification. So for example, we can see that for tomatoes, right, and you can see it by cherries, pints, slicers, and heirloom, that it actually does make a difference, right? You get a significant premium for that certification. We don't see that this is true across all products. So for example, we see for leafy greens that they don't actually get a significantly higher price for that certification. And this gives us some data that then we can use to help advise the farmers and ranchers we work with about, does it actually make sense to become certified organic, right? Or is that sort of local differentiation or other kind of differentiation enough? We can also do things that look at, for example, is there any relationship between ground beef prices at these farmers markets and the commodity market? And interestingly, we see that there is not a significant relationship there. And so we can maybe think about local food markets as one way to sort of hedge our risk, right? So with commodity prices, you're going to just see that natural fluctuation that occurs. We see more stability in these farmers market pricing, right, that don't appear to be impacted by commodity market pricing. On the other hand, this doesn't tell us the quantity of product that we can sell through those kinds of farmers markets, right? But it sort of provides some fodder for additional investigation along these lines. We've also done some market channel assessments here in Colorado, and this is something that was started by some colleagues in New York at Cornell University, and we've continued then here at Colorado State. And this was in partnership with our Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, the Colorado Department of Ag, and many others. And so when Matt LaRue started this, right, he was really trying to think about the fact that that many producers don't have enough information about how do they really evaluate a market opportunity, right? If you're getting started, you may just think, okay, well, I'm going to go and sell at a farmer's market in the closest one. But really, we see that there's a lot of differences that occur within these markets. So the costs are different, the volume of sales are different, labor requirements are different, price and profit are therefore different. And in addition to that, the way that farmer perceives their lifestyle preferences and risks associated with each of these markets really vary, right? So you're going to have some producers that love selling at farmers markets and some that's sort of their worst nightmare to have to interact with their customers like that on a weekly basis. Likewise, a CSA arrangement, community support agriculture arrangement, tends to carry low risk because you've sold all of your shares at the beginning of the season and you have that revenue that's come in. Whereas we hear often that sales to restaurants are risky because chefs often turn over. And so just because you had a relationship with one chef doesn't mean you have the next one. Also that they notoriously order small amounts and they pay late. And so that can make it very risky. So to help producers think about evaluating these market opportunities, we collect some information from the producer. We don't collect complete variable cost information. We collect information on weekly sales, on weekly expenditure, on transportation and distance to market, and we collect information on labor that's utilized, both paid and unpaid. And we do this for many reasons, but most importantly, we see that labor and transportation are the variable expenses that are the largest for these alternative markets and that shift the most based on the market. And so that's why we really focus on those. We start with labor utilization at harvest, and we do this because we assume that if you're going to grow broccoli, your labor needs associated with growing broccoli don't vary by market. But where they start to vary is with harvest. So for example, instead of taking broccoli, let's think about raspberries. So if you're growing raspberries and you do a pick your own operation, the costs associated with harvesting that product are going to be very different than if you actually send labor into the field, they harvest it, package it in clamshells, and send it off somewhere, right? So we want to start there. We have to collect this information during a peak week in the season, which producers hate, but we find it's the only way to get accurate information about labor utilization by market channel, because producers tend to do a really good job tracking sales by market channel, but not necessarily expenses. And so we really want them to record it in real time. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to give you an example of the kind of ways that you can use this information to inform producers about how they're performing relative to others, and then they can use that to make changes based on their markets. So here what we're looking at is the marketing profit margin percentiles, and this is just for direct channels. So on the far left, you're seeing all direct channels, and then on the right three bars here, I'm showing you CSAs, farmers markets, and farm stands. So the first thing you'll notice here is that the variability in performance is not much for CSAs, right? That there's very little variability in performance versus what we see for farmers markets and farm stands. That yellow are the top, so that shows you above that is the top 25th percentile of performers. The green is those bottom performers, right? The bottom performers, so under that would be the bottom performers. The orange is the median level of performance. And so what we do when we do these market channel assessments is we actually create customized reports for individual growers with recommendations, and we can show them then where they fall, right? And if they're doing better than that top 75th percentile of performers, we can say that's great, this is a high performing channel. If they're in the orange or green areas, we can say, you know, this channel's not performing that well. And we try to look at the things that those top performers are doing so that we can get some recommendations about how you might gain efficiencies. So just as one example, we've talked to producers about the fact that, you know, when you have labor at farmers markets, if nobody shows up to the farmers market that day, you still have that labor sitting there, right? And that might happen on a rainy day, for example. If you can have your CSA drop-off at the farmers market, right now you're not having labor at the CSA drop-off and the farmers market, but you're gaining some efficiencies from labor there. And so those are the kinds of things that we might recommend. Likewise, we can see, because of this variability in performance by farmers markets and farm stands, that some of that might have to do with some people are better managers than others. It may also have to do with the fact that all farmers markets and all farm stands aren't created equal. Some farm stands are actually staffed, some are not. Some farmers markets tend to cater to commuters or tend to cater to household shoppers. And so you really want to understand why a particular market may work best for your operation rather than just choosing the closest available. So we have more information about this, these farmers market, the market channel assessments available at our website, foodsystems.colostate.edu. And as part of this, we have produced some statewide benchmarks in conjunction with the Colorado Farmers Market Association. Now, moving towards national data that I was starting to mention, we can look at a sort of higher level about financial performance implications for these local food enterprises. Much of the information that I'm presenting here today is available in fact sheets that we do have available through localfoodeconomics.com, which is part of the e-extension Economic Impacts of Local and Regional Food Systems Community of Practice. And if this is a topic you're interested in, I encourage you to visit the website and take a look. This community of practice has been funded largely through the USDA Ag Marketing Services. So to do this national work, we've worked mostly with the ARMS data. It's the Agricultural Resource Management Survey data. Most of the data you're going to see here is based on 2013, but we are actually in the process of updating it, including data through 2016. So keep checking it out. ARMS is a nationally representative survey that targets about 30,000 farms annually, and it's really the best source of farm financial information that we have. So it provides a lot more financial detail than does the census, for example. So you can see that for this 2013 data, out of about 17,000 total respondents, we can see that about 1,000 of them are participating in local food channels. Of that 1,000, over 660 are participating in direct-to-consumer markets only. Just over 130 are participating in intermediated markets only, and then over 200 are participating in both direct-to-consumer and intermediated markets. So one of the first things that we can see from the data that I think is really important is that unlike traditional agriculture, when we think about that farms get larger, they become more efficient, and the way they do this is substituting labor for capital, right? So they buy more equipment, and then they need less labor to produce the same output. We see that the exact opposite is true for our local food producers. So here what you're seeing is just the local food producers, and we divide them by scale. So the far left is under 75,000 in gross cash farm income. Then we see 75 to 350, 350 to a million, and over 3 million. And if you pay attention just to that green bar, that is their share of variable expenses devoted to labor, right? And so this would only reflect paid labor. Keep that in mind. So we get questions about, well, is it just because these local food producers aren't paying labor, right? They're using interns or apprentices or household labor. And we think that might be true if you're down in the under 75,000, but once you get closer to that 350,000 range, you really need paid labor, right? And you can see it certainly when you get to over 350,000 and then over a million, right? You have a lot of paid labor on that operation, so you can see that continues to increase. The next thing we do with this sample is we divide them into quartiles segmented by profitability, right? Here we define profitability as return on assets, and I'm happy to talk about why we do that. You can also talk to Sarah. You're lucky to have a local expert to talk about that, but it's one way that economists often define profitability. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at the best performers, which is quartile 4, and then the low performers, right, which is quartile 1. And what this does, it provides benchmark information for comparison of groups, across groups and time. And I mentioned that we are starting to update this with more recent data. And so here again, we're looking at those same local food producers divided by scale. And so what you're seeing here is that across every single sales class, we see that about 50% of our producers have positive return on assets or are profitable, right? And in agriculture, that is pretty significant, right? Especially when we look at some of these really smaller scale farms, right? So you are seeing with that quartile 1, remember those are the lower performers, that the people who are in that smaller sales category, right, under 75,000, they are really not doing well, right? They have very they're really not profitable, right? But we can see though that when you're in that quartile 3, you're just about breaking even. That's why you can't see the bar. And then at quartile 4, we actually see pretty strong return on assets, right? These local food producers are figuring out how to take their assets and use them very effectively. Here we do the same type of exercise, except instead of dividing our sample by scale, we're dividing them by the market channel that they use. So direct to consumer only, intermediated only, and then both direct and intermediated channels. And again, we're seeing that about 50% of our sample is profitable. And we see that, interestingly, those that are using both direct and intermediate channels, right, that low performing quartile is really not profitable. But that top performing quartile has a really very impressive return on assets, particularly compared to traditional agriculture. The last thing I wanted to highlight here is in regards to urban agriculture. There's increasing data that's coming out on urban ag, and I think, given some of these changes that I mentioned in the Farm Bill, we're going to see even more information coming out, over the next 5 or so years. But I think the best source of data we have right now is a 2012 national survey of urban farmers that was led by Carolyn Dimitri, who's at NYU and is an ag economist there. And what they found is that 26% had mission statements focused on markets, right? So that really what we're seeing is 3/4 of these operations are focused on community, education, or food security goals. So they're not really focused on having sort of these profitable, viable farming operations. They reported that 28% had a primary farmer earning a living from the farm. But really, overall, they conclude these urban farms face real problems related to farm survivability and farmer livelihoods, right? And part of the challenge here really may be this focus on these other sort of non-directly economic or profitability goals. But so I do want to highlight the fact that even though we have growing interest in urban agriculture, that I think the majority of these operations really are not meant to be a viable scaled food producing operations, but are really meant to support these other education and community goals and outcomes, which is, again, not bad. It's just something to really keep in mind as we move forward with these kinds of initiatives. Now transitioning to thinking about what do we know about the regional economic development implications of local and regional food systems. So I do a lot of work assessing multiplier impacts, right? What happens when we put an invested dollar into a local food initiative? What kinds of returns do we see? And of course, I started doing this work, and I think probably those of you who heard of multiplier, because this is how local economic developers, or especially our elected officials, want to think about it, right? If we invest this, what is the return on investments? Overall, what we see is, generally speaking, small short-term gains that result from local and regional food systems. And there are a growing number of studies that have been done in this space. But again, we really see generally small returns. I was also part of a group that put together a report for the National Farm to School Network on evaluating the economic impacts of farm to school. And again, we see very similar kinds of information, right? And so if you're interested in thinking about how to do a kind of economic impact assessment relative to farm to school, this is the kind of thing you can look at. And I'll mention that in terms of thinking more broadly about how you evaluate the economic impacts of local food system initiatives, we did put together a toolkit for the USDA Ag Marketing Services led by my colleague Don Thilmany. And so you can go and see that, and there's lots of case studies, and all of that's available on the website localfoodeconomics.com. But there's some words of caution in thinking about the economic impacts of local and regional food systems. And I think this is really important because we don't want to just think about the gross impacts. We want to think about the net impacts, right? And so this is because we have finite resources, right? Especially when you're in the Midwest, every acre of arable land is already in production. And so what happens is, if we decide we're going to shift production from, say, corn or soy into fruits and vegetables, we have a positive impact that occurs from the production of fruit and vegetables, but we also have the loss of that production that was in corn or soy, right? And we need to think about that. And so these, we can think about like the opportunity cost, for example, being on the supply or production side, or the demand or consumer side, or both. And so just a couple of other quick examples. This is something that Luann Lohr and Adam Diamond put out from USDA Ag Marketing Service in 2011. And so what you can see here is where we have higher levels of competition for farmers market vendors. And so in areas that are in the red, if you put a new farmers market there, what's going to happen is that likely a producer may pull out of one market and go to another market, right? And if they do that and don't see changes in the sales that occur, right, or the profitability of that market, then really there's really no positive economic impact that's occurred, right? You're just shifting sales from one place to another. And so that's something that you really want to think about when if one of your goals is around trying to support positive economic impacts. And this is an arable land example that I already mentioned. And if you're interested in reading more, Dave Swenson out of Iowa State does a great job with these kinds of things. And then just one other example is from a study that I did with some colleagues at Cornell. And we looked at, for a food hub in New York State, regional access, what happens, how do their customers respond to the availability of products from the food hub? And we find that about half of them report that they purchase less from other sources due to the availability of regional access. And we actually were able to quantify what that reduction in purchases were from other local businesses, right? Because thinking about not just the positive impacts, again, of that food hub, but also then the decrease in purchases from other businesses is really important. So when I said that what we see from these multiplier studies, these economic impact studies, is pretty small short-term economic impacts that occur. And what I think is that actually some of these other economic impacts are perhaps more important to evaluate and to think about when you're trying to think about the potential impacts of this kind of investment or programming. So we do have some evidence that businesses near farmers markets reported higher sales on market days. We also see that farmers markets increase property values in the market district. But thinking about some of these longer term impacts that are harder to evaluate are really important. So for example, farmers markets as business incubators, right, that they provide the infrastructure necessary to build skills and gain business experience. Those producers who are selling at those markets get direct feedback, right, on what's sort of working and what's not working. that regular interaction can generate and circulate knowledge, right, that vendors can use to develop new products and creative ways of marketing them. And that sales income may be less important than the skills and business experience developed, right? So do we actually see evidence, and I think anecdotally we probably do, right, that a producer who starts at a farmer's market one year, they may not be at that farmer's market long term, right, because that farmer's market may not be that profitable for them, but through sales at that market, they were able to develop skills and business experience that allowed them, right, enabled them to sell through some of these other markets. For example, we have a food hub in Fort Collins, and they have a policy that if a producer wants to sell through them, they need to have 10 existing wholesale clients. Where you can't just right off the bat get 10 wholesale clients, right? You need to start somewhere. And so starting small through some of these markets that have pretty low cost of entry or barriers to entry is important. And lastly, in this space, I just wanted to say that we've been doing a study in New York for many years now with farmers markets. And so we've done this with the Green Markets, which is the largest network of farmers markets in the country, I think actually maybe even the world. And we see, we're trying to look at some of these exchanges that happen at the market and whether or not they actually impact farmers and what they're doing, and not just farmers, but also rural communities and economies. And we see that 75% of farms made or intend to make changes to their business based on ideas that they get from customers in the market. See, 45% of these farms made these changes to products sold in both rural and urban markets, and 82% of farms reported they shared ideas or intend to that they got through green markets with farmers in their home communities, right? So it's not just the farms that are selling in these markets that actually benefit, but actually their neighbor farms and those neighboring communities with some pretty strong evidence. So I mentioned to you, we have this toolkit on how you evaluate the economic impacts of local foods. You can go to our website, localfoodeconomics.com, to get lots more information. And of course, I've gone through this very quickly. So moving forward, right, we have information that, at least some information that there can be some positive farm and ranch profitability impacts at all scales that can occur from local food markets. And we also see that there are these short-term economic impacts, but they're small, that can occur from local food markets. But potentially what's more important is thinking about some of these sort of longer term impacts that are harder to measure. So what I wanted to do is tell you about what we're doing with this information at Colorado State, because there may be some pieces in here that you all decide you could replicate in Missouri. So we have a project that we're calling Rural Wealth Creation, exploring food system-led development strategies. And we've received over $2 million so far from external funds to support these efforts. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, food system development strategies involve rural-urban linkages. And this is really important to remember because before I went back and did my PhD, I worked as an agricultural economic development specialist for Cornell Cooperative Extension. And in some programs or some discussions that I was in there, one of the things that I would hear from people is, oh, we just want to focus on local food within our county. And I understand that, right? But I think, we're trying to, I think of strategies that are going to lift lift the tides of all boats, or, I always mess up these expressions. But anyway, that we're really trying to all support each other here. And so the reality is that the places that we have most of our eaters are not the same places where we have most of our farms. You can see this is the 2012 Census of Agriculture County Profile for Denver. And we see that in 2012, they had 10 farms down from 24 in 2007. And as someone who works a lot in that area, I can't even think of what those 10 farms are, right? So I think this is probably an overestimate. And up top with this map, you can see that just like the rest of the country, we have 80% of our population that's concentrated in urban areas. Now in our state, it happens to be concentrated along the Front Range of Colorado, right? But 80% of our population across the country now lives in these urban places. And so thinking about how those urban dollars, right, can be leveraged to support farmers and ranchers is really important. So what I want to do is actually play you a quick video of this project, so you can sort of get a sense of what we're doing.
In cities across the country, local governments are developing food policies to support healthy, vibrant communities. This includes what food is available, how it gets there, and where it is sold. But what about the people working in the agricultural community communities that grow or raise, process, and ship that food? How are the urban policies and investments affecting them? What if we brought farmers and urban consumers together to envision how urban policies could support entire regions? At Colorado State University, a group of researchers is doing just that. CSU extension agents, faculty from 6 colleges, and researchers from the agricultural experiment stations are working together to create a tool to help communities better understand benefits and potential trade-offs resulting from urban food policies, programming, and initiatives. Additionally, we hope to work with regions to help them prioritize investment opportunities and then bring state and federal funders to the table.
I think the study needs to be done because farmers in general are price takers. There are a limited number of sellers that they actually have access to. You know, if you can eliminate some transportation costs by making food more local, definitely makes sense.
I think it's been very evident that the consumers have taken an interest in figuring out the origin of where their food comes from, and I think there is a real pride in buying local and supporting the local growers.
Our goal is to help city and county officials, nonprofit organizations, and food policy councils to understand how their programming, policies, and investments can support not just urban communities and households, but the entire region. As one example, as part of the Denver Food Vision, the city and county of Denver have a goal of 25% of all institutional procurement coming from Colorado grown, raised, and processed sources. We hope that our team can play a role in helping to spur conversation across rural and urban regions in a way to achieve that goal that meets all needs.
In the end, this case study of Denver and its rural communities will yield a model that can be used by other cities across the country to better enable good policy and investment that not only provides better healthy access to urban areas, but also builds an environment for statewide agriculture producers to profitably supply that food to the urban population.
So as part of this effort, we're working very closely with the City and County of Denver. They, as you just heard in the video, underwent a food planning process, the Denver Food Vision and Plan, and actually have an action plan that they're starting to roll out as part of that. And so they've tried to start looking at what is the total spend, not just in the City and County of Denver, but in the metro region, and how much of that is local, right? So they get a baseline of what they're doing. And so that we can then also give this information to producers so that they have a better sense of what are the prices and quantities of what commodities Denver's looking for, what are the attributes, right? So for example, some of the policies have preferences for small and mid-scale farms. Some of them have preferences for organic. And we actually are in the process of hiring somebody to do more compilation of this who's going to be a city and county employee. So Denver has a food procurement committee. You may have something similar in some of your cities. And this is a subcommittee of the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Coalition. The Denver Sustainable Food Policy Coalition was established by the mayor, and so the people on that are appointed. And they created the City Food Purchasing Standard Policy Working Group in August of 2017, and they actually adopted this issue brief for city food purchasing standards in June of 2018. So in the brief, they define sustainable food by the Good Food Purchasing Standards. And I'm not sure if you have heard of or working with the Good Food Purchasing Standards and program in Missouri, but this is something that's been adopted by many cities across the country. It was started in Los Angeles. And in this, what happens is food and beverage are procured under one of the following or multiple values, and each of these items that are procured are essentially rated based on their procurement. All of these procurement standards are verified by third-party sources. But what's interesting is that, you know, these are national standards. And so in some contexts, they don't really make a lot of sense. And as we've started to have conversations with both the Denver folks and our producers, we really can see some of the disconnect, right? And I think one of the reasons is that we ask this question, you know, are the right people at the table? And this is a picture of Mayor Hancock with members of the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council and Coalition. And you know, if you go and look who's there, it's a wonderful group of hardworking people. They don't really have strong supply chain representation or strong, I would say, scaled farm representation, right? So they have some of the small urban producers that are included, but not some of the larger producers, particularly those that are going to be able to supply local food at prices that are going to meet some of the procurement goals for the food access and food security questions that Denver is trying to address. And so what we've been trying to do through this project is actually create opportunities where we can facilitate more interaction between some producers of scale in particular, although not just of scale, but definitely of scale too, and some of the policymakers and buyers in and around Denver. And so this is a postcard as an example from one of the meetings that we had recently. And I'll tell you that the conversations that took place at this type of convening were very interesting. Right. So at first, there was certainly some tension as Denver was talking about some of the things that it's doing. It tends to frame what it does in terms of food security and food access kinds of questions, which of course are things producers care about, but it's not things that they automatically see as a market opportunity, right? So even though, for example, the producers we brought are very engaged in conversations in and around the DC area, right, about federal policy, I think that the way that the language was used in these conversations may make producers think that these kinds of urban food policies don't pertain to them. But I think, you know, towards the end of this day and a half meeting, we were able to get to a place where I think policymakers better understood, for example, the need to adapt some of the good food purchasing program standards to actually meet some of the local climate and conditions of Colorado farmers and ranchers. And I think producers were actually also excited about some of these opportunities, right? These producers are already in most of the retail stores, for example, but they hadn't necessarily tapped into some of the institutional procurement in the same kind of way. Actually, one of the takeaways from this is that in Colorado, we have a fresh potato industry. So our potatoes are almost all fresh. So they're not sold and turned into French fries and potato chips. So they're, you know, healthy. And we do a lot of research here at CSU looking at some of the health properties. And so they're now interested in trying to work more with Denver public schools on procurement. So we're excited to see that. We've also held meetings with ranchers, and we've done these things, started to do these things called scenario analyses. So we've tried to say for the Good Food Purchasing Program, there's some of the standards that are in there that our farmers and ranchers view as deal breakers. So they're things that just aren't going to work, right, because of our growing conditions. For example, the Steamboat Springs area, that's Routt County. We essentially have a 4-month growing season, right? So we can grow grass 4 months. And so it precludes some of the things that the Good Food Purchasing Program wants to see. But there's other things that are part of the Good Food Purchasing Program where if there's enough of a premium given and the logistics work out, that these are things that our farmers and ranchers might be able to do and that might work. And so really what we see is that, you know, that having that participation by farmers and ranchers in these metro market opportunities discussions are really, really important. And so we're actually going to be establishing a procurement committee of farmers and ranchers to work alongside that Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council group. And we're cautiously optimistic about what can happen through enhanced interaction between these groups, right? And sort of increase our ability to both meet the needs and goals of the urban constituents at the same time supporting farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. But of course, to do this, thinking about the infrastructure is really right and is really important. And so one of the questions we ask is the right infrastructure in place? And so we worked with the Colorado Department of Agriculture to get lists of where we have manufacturing facilities in the state. They don't actually maintain lists of manufacturing facilities, but all of these manufacturing facilities are permitted. And so we can get a sense of where they're located and then do some additional investigation about, are they willing to do co-packing, for example, right? So that instead of a farmer rancher or a rural community or a regional community needing to build a new asset, we can actually better investigate in these underutilized assets before making new investments, right? And I think that's actually something that sort of this food hub world has overlooked, right? Can we actually find opportunities to better work with or better incentivize existing distributors to work with small and mid-scale farms, for example. And one example I like to give about this is we just recently completed a Colorado Blueprint of Food and Agriculture. So this was led by Dawn Thilmany and Greg Graff and myself, who are all in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at CSU, and with the governor of Colorado's Food Systems Advisory Council that I facilitate. And we went around the state and held these different town hall listening sessions. We presented data at the beginning, and then we really tried to get out what is some of the data, what are we missing from just looking at the data. And one of the things we heard when we were up in the northwest corner of the state is that there had been a group, a local food policy council that had been meeting for a long time. And again, they didn't have good representation of sort of the processing and supply chain, similar to, I think, what's happening in Denver. And so they had determined that one of the major challenges in their region was lack of access to small-scale meat processing. And so they went on thinking about how they're going to do fundraising to get they wanted to get a mobile processing unit. And so they really, this is, a few years, and they've moved ahead in doing this. And finally, at one of their meetings, one of the local meat processors showed up and said, hey, if you all think that the problem is lack of access to processing, why did you not come and talk to me? And really, it looks like what the challenge was there was lack of access to USDA inspected meat processing. And so this person from Brothers Custom Meats actually made some additional investments in his facility. He became USDA inspected. And from there, he's developed a retail store. He's developed wholesale sales to the Denver metro area. And they've also been able to help to spur a number of these value-added meat businesses. You can see one of the logos up there, the pasture-fed beef. Luckily, because of these changes in the Farm Bill that I've mentioned, there's a lot of money to support local and regional food system activity. I've put up here USDA grants and loans that support farm-to-school activities, but there's other similar kinds of decision tree kinds of things that talk about local and regional food systems in general. And I know when I've looked at this for Colorado that we're really leaving many of these federal dollars on the table, and that there's a lot of opportunity to utilize these federal dollars, again, to thinking about how can we incentivize existing processors and distributors to work with some of these smaller scale businesses. And I'd be happy to talk about opportunities to do that more in our question and answer session. There's also opportunities to leverage public-private partnerships. We saw the Finney program was supported again and actually made mandatory funding, right? And the Finney program is supporting many of these double-up food buck programs. But here as an example, we see Kroger, which is King Soopers in Colorado, right, where they're actually working to try to promote Colorado fruits and vegetables in the store. And also to then help to support some of these double up buck initiatives. Lastly, I just want to say that sometimes there's this halo effect, right? The halo effect is when one trait of a person or thing is used to make an overall judgment of that person or thing, right? So you can see the little dog there, and oh, he's got such luxurious fur, right? It's such a pretty dog, right? He must be a really good boy, but in truth, he's not. And we have to think about local food is not the answer to all of our woes, right? It's definitely not. And that's why when I was talking earlier about really spending some time within your community, thinking about what are the goals or the values of your community. As researchers, we can help you to evaluate trade-offs associated with different kinds of initiatives. But really, you have to decide, who is it that you're trying to help? Is it that you're trying to create new opportunities for small and mid-scale or beginning farmers or veteran farmers and ranchers? Is it that you're trying to promote food security, right, improve food security outcomes in urban places? Because depending on what that goal is, local food may or may not actually be the right kind of investment or programming or initiative. And so spending time really thinking about that is very important. We actually have a project at CSU right now looking at, are there quality impacts associated with locally procured items? We're doing this in the context of farm to school, because indeed when we talk to the school districts, right, and to the nutrition service directors, that's one thing we hear is that locally grown items are higher quality, but we really have very little data to support that, so we really want to back that up. So I think I've talked enough. Here's my contact info, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all live in the upcoming question and answer session. So thanks again for inviting me and including me in this really exciting event.